Thank you for joining us for day 2 of the branches of government. Today we'll talk about the executive branch, and we have our trio again from political science faculty members to talk more about the executive branch. The chat feature is open if you want to ask a question or share a comment or thought. It's open for you all. There will be questions in between that you can share or ask. They're not really a panel, but ask the professors. So I don't know. We're gonna roll a dice and see who takes the lead on this.
We should do it today in a traditional manner. We should just always ask Stephen to go first.
I don't think that's very fair at all. But
you just know more about this than we do. You're the American.
In our last session, we noted that there are 3 branches of the federal government, and that's the purpose of this series, is to cover each branch in some detail. And last time we covered Congress, which is the legislative branch, and talked about its role in the political process, and noted that it's vested all legislative powers. So the power to make law is vested with Congress. It then becomes the job of the executive branch, headed up by the president, to see to it that those laws, and for that matter, decisions of the courts, are executed and enforced and carried out. It's interesting. I assume my colleagues would agree with me on this. I noted last time that I think in the minds of the founding fathers, Congress would be the first among equals. They certainly gave Congress more constitutional authority than they gave to the president. But in actual practice, the presidency is clearly the most powerful branch, and it's been that way almost from the start. And so one of the things I think we'll probably talk about today a little bit are theories and ideas about presidential power. As presidential power become too vast, is power now distorted at the federal level? And then I think Dr. Duggan wanted to make some points about how much the executive branch has changed over time, perhaps in particular. But Article 2 sets up the office of the presidency, and as we talked about last time, if Congress consists of 2 chambers, the presidency is a lot different. A lot of power is concentrated in the hands of one person. But the institution itself is quite vast. Below the president, if you think about it in a hierarchical sense, there's the office of the vice president. There are then 15, today I guess, executive departments, and then operating usually within those departments, but not exclusively, are various agencies. So a lot of what the president does with regards to the actual exercise of power involves a lot of delegation of power to those that operate the various parts of the executive branch. And I guess the last thing I'll say is kind of as an illustration or example of how powerful that branch has grown. It now has billions of employees. I mean, the odds are very good. If you work for the federal government, you're working in the executive branch of the government. It doesn't take near as many people to run and operate the legislative and judicial branches. So it's a very powerful branch, the most powerful branch of the federal government, and well worth our time to discuss.
So just to kind of add to what Stephen was talking about, which is that the executive branch has really changed a lot, especially from the 19th to the 20th century. You know, when you talk about some of the presidents in the 20th century, you say, Chester Arthur and Benjamin Harrison and, Taft and then you kind of go through them and you say, Franklin Pierce. These are all nobodies in our historical record, right? I always joke with my students and I'm like, tell me all of the great things that Chester Arthur can do. And of course he passed a sort of reform of patronage, but his presidency was kind of not very spectacular, as were a lot of other presidents. The only sort of notable 19th century presidents were Andrew Jackson, who kind of was very much a sort of populist president that changed voting and then, of course, Lincoln, right? So those are the exceptions that prove the rule that the presidency was really formed in its current form in the 20th century. And of course, Theodore Roosevelt was the first president to use radio, but it was really Woodrow Wilson that began the sort of modern presidency. Up until that point, we actually didn't have a State of the Union. The president, starting with Jefferson, would send over the State of the Union and they would read it. And so this whole pomp and circumstance that we've come to accept as being the way that things have always been done is actually totally new. It started under Woodrow Wilson, who, went over and gave it as a direct address. And so I think that Thomas Jefferson would frankly be horrified if he saw the State of the Union and everybody standing up and then greeting the president as he walks down the aisle. That's really not what they wanted. They also, campaigns. It was considered to be unseemly for the president to go out and make speeches and do the modern campaign in the way that they do them today. They didn't even attend their conventions themselves. So really, it was the radio that first established the modern presidency. But even before that, the telegraph kind of extended their power. But so in the 20th century, you have some reforms that really began to start the personal presidency, the one where people began to view the president as the sort of embodiment of the nation. And that is the creation of the income tax. Was a huge change in our politics, because now the president had all of this money and could start a bureaucracy. And so now certainly there was a bureaucracy before that point, but it would nowhere near what we have today. And then, of course, after Woodrow Wilson, we had, of course, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who further made for a personal president. And he actually operated almost as a benevolent dictator during his time in office. There was pushback from Congress, but as everybody knows, he had 3.5 terms. He won 4 presidential elections. He operated with a massive amount of executive orders. Everybody believes that, executive orders either started with George W. Bush or they started with Barack Obama, but really the person who has the most executive orders was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And then he spoke directly to the people through the fireside chats, which was an innovation. And he had incredible power. And generally speaking, the presidency, there's almost 2 presidencies. There's a domestic presidency that is less powerful. And then there's a foreign policy president that operates in some ways like a dictator, especially during times of war. And so during World War II, Franklin Delano Roosevelt sort of created what I believe is the modern presidency. And, we would have let down after World War II, but then we had the Cold War right after that. So Truman was doing containment, and we were on a permanent war footing. The only president that really wasn't on a permanent war footing, although he did fight some minor wars, was Bill Clinton. Since Franklin Delano Roosevelt, all of the other presidents have either been in the Cold War or the War on Terror. And so the United States is an empire. And a lot of people don't realize we've got 1,000 military bases throughout the world, and we're in most of the countries in the world. And so the president can move troops around and operate, as I said, almost like a dictator, at least for the 4 to 8 years that they're in power. And the other major innovation that has taken place, which is sort of modern military, is quick. We can destroy Russia within 30 minutes through intercontinental ballistic missiles. And the president has sole power over nuclear missiles. And as of course, Stephen was talking about, there's this huge bureaucracy, but not only a huge bureaucracy, we've got 17 different intelligence agencies. So each of the military has their own intelligence agency. And then we've got, you know, the Department of Energy, the Coast Guard, you know, the Department of State, Homeland Security, the National Security Agency. So the United States has this huge, massive intelligence network. And the president is at the apex of it. He gets all of that intelligence. He's the sort of the final say for all of it. So it's a little bit scary what the power that the president has over foreign policy. And there's a movement in the United States called the unitary executive theory, which is a theory that the president deserves even more power. And there are schools of legal thought that are pushing the Constitution. They often cite Hamilton because, of course, Hamilton wanted more power. And so he wrote into the Federalist Papers that, you know, he even wanted a king. And so a lot of people cite Hamilton and they say, well, we should give even more power to the president, right? William Barr is part of this whole unitary executive movement that wants to give near dictatorial powers to the president. And so here we are.
And let me just add to that, that Congress has given up some of its power to the presidency over the last, I don't know, 7, 8 decades. So this isn't all just a power grab by the president. Some of this has just been lawfully ceded by the Congress and giving the president more authority than the president previously had. I was listening to an interview. I don't even want to say the person's name to make it political, but this person was saying that they're being interviewed by Axios. They're a Republican, and they were saying how, you know, their view on the budget. The interviewers, it's Ted Cruz, I guess I'll just say, but to Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, you know, you're a budget hawk, and yet you voted for these massive expanses of spending. And he said, well, you know, President Trump wanted it. It's not what I wanted, but it's what he wanted. And I'm thinking, but your job is to check the president's desires. Your job is to protect, from that, or to check it. I was surprised that the interviewer didn't mention that to him. I thought that was an important point. So some of this, and you know, to a degree, both parties do this when their person is in power. This is why, and Stu, I'll let you correct me if I'm wrong on this. A lot of libertarians I know will advocate split government, where one party controls the Congress and one party controls the White House. That's when you start to get smaller government. The other thing I just want to say real quickly that's interesting about the American presidency is that the American president is both the head of government and the head of state. A lot of other democratic systems, they have those roles split up. So, you know, you might look at a president's schedule. This just happened even the other day with President Trump. I was looking at his schedule, campaigning all around the country. It goes back to the White House to have some kind of pumpkin event, some Halloween event with kids. This is what presidents do. I mean, I remember I study Middle East politics. And I remember when the Oslo Accords, I was reading about the Oslo Accords between the Israelis and Palestinians that Bill Clinton was brokering in the 90s. And I saw in one of the books I was reading, President Clinton's daily schedule they had listed. And it was interesting. He was meeting with the leaders of Israel and the Palestinian Authority. And then like in between the two, he met like a softball, I think it was a softball team that had just won the national championship. And I'm thinking, what an absurd transition that is. You have to say to Yasser Arafat, like, I'm sorry, I have to go. I have to go meet these kids to go, you know, give them a trophy or whatever it was. And it's a nice thing to do. But in other systems, you have somebody whose job it is to do those ceremonial roles, while another person's job is to do the work. So that's, to me, another interesting dynamic of the American presidency.
Yeah, I agree with everything that everyone said here. Piggyback on what y'all been talking about, you know, it's interesting. Ted noted out radio and followed by television. You know, that was a big contributor to the growing power of the presidency. You know, the media gives the president a lot more coverage. It's an easier branch to cover. It's personified, you know, personalized the presidency. We all know the president. We all know the president's wife. We know the president has kids. You don't know your members of Congress near as well. You know, local media might give a little added coverage to your elected representative or senators, but by and large, the national media is fixated on the presidency. And that reinforces this idea that the president is the government and that everybody else are kind of bit players, in a system controlled primarily by the presidency. Kind of in a tutorial sense, I guess part of this is also to kind of explain who has power over what. Brian, I thought your point about, how Congress has acquiesced a great deal of power to the president is accurate too. Congress still holds the constitutional tools if they want to use them to wield back presidential power. The question is if they want to do so. They still hold the power of the purse. The Congress commands this vast military that's stationed everywhere, but that military has to be created by Congress. So there are a lot of powers that Congress maintains that Congress could use if it wanted to, but as both of you alluded to, Congress doesn't want to for whatever reason. In part, it alleviates them from taking responsibility for foreign policy failures, if you want to think of it in that kind of hypocritical way. But I remember the first Gulf War, everybody that, all members of Congress stepped over themselves to give the president a standing ovation because that foreign adventure went well. Had that foreign adventure not gone well, they would have stepped over each other to criticize the president. So they're in the enviable position of kind of waiting to see if these foreign policy adventures of the president succeed or not, and either attack or, I was with you all along, throw their support behind whatever the president's decided. Yeah, Congress really is not playing its co-equal role whatsoever anymore, particularly around the foreign policy, as we talked about.
Well, I think also, just to add to that, just real quickly, is that, we have to remember the president's the only person that's elected by everybody. I mean, I guess you could add the vice president on there as well. But I think that's an important point too, because sometimes members of Congress, oftentimes they may be popular in their home district, but they're not necessarily as popular as their president, right? Particularly if they're in a district that voted for that president. So a lot of times they're afraid to go after that president because everybody elected that president versus, or at least the majority of people in most cases, versus just being elected by your district.
Which is an interesting point. We've kind of been talking about how the power of the presidency has grown so vast, and probably all in general agreement that we're a little concerned about it. But I guess to be fair, given that the president is the only figure that has any kind of nationwide backing, I guess you might say, with regards to how he's selected, that could be used as an argument for a stronger president, in a sense. But it's a good point. He's really our only national figure.
And I just want to say real quick, I'm sorry, because I have to go in a minute, Ted. I apologize because I have a meeting at 3:30. So I just want to say this really quickly. I mean, I think if, and again, big if, Joe Biden wins and the Democrats control the Senate, one of the things that I think will be interesting is because, Joe Biden is a creature of the Senate. He got elected at 29. Right? I mean, he spent, 35 years or something like this in the Senate until he became vice president. I do wonder, probably this won't happen, but I do wonder if he's going to work to kind of bring some of that power back to the presidency. I'm sorry, back to the Congress, should he get elected. So anyway, I apologize for interrupting. I have to go in a minute, so I apologize.
No worries. I just wanted to, one of the themes of the earlier class is the same theme of this class, which is the increasing partisan behavior of both parties. So this struggle to for dominance, and that means that the president actually has less of a check on their power, because the party that is aligning themselves with the president, or the party of the president, the Congress members will never criticize or try to curtail that power, because he is a vehicle to achieve their policy ends. So in the case of Ted Cruz, he of course is going to allow Trump to do whatever he wants, because he views himself as struggling not against the presidency. He views himself as struggling against Democrats. And so he's not going to say anything. It was interesting because most people talked about how the president was becoming too powerful under George W. Bush, right? Because George W. Bush really sort of embraced the unitary executive theory, and he got us involved in the two wars. And so a lot of people were hoping that Barack Obama would take some of the power out of the presidency and put it into Congress. But he didn't do that because Congress was basically going to try to block everything that he did. And so he continued the partisan war that took place. And he also ended up using a lot of the tools that were created by George W. Bush. For instance, the Joint Special Operations Command, which is a group of special forces soldiers from all of the different militaries that go throughout the world. And so that's the way we do war now. So the way we do war gives power over to the presidency because JSOC is under the control of the executive, or the executive branch controls JSOC. So that means that the president can send troops anywhere in the world, you know, overnight and not tell anybody. Now, technically, there's this supposed gang of 8, the most powerful members of Congress, and you know the 2 members of the chair and the co-chair of the intelligence committees in both the House and the Senate, and then the Speaker of the House and various different. So you're supposed to share intelligence, but the president doesn't. He doesn't share intelligence with the members of Congress. He keeps them in the dark.
Yeah, information is power, and presidents don't like to share that. You know, going back to the effect of partisanship and political parties, it's another informal role. It says nothing about parties, so it's an informal role, but it's a powerful one. Presidents are the de facto leaders of their parties. In fact, to the consternation, I would guess, of moderate Republicans is that Donald Trump is now the face of the Republican Party. So yes, if you're going to, as you were using the Ted Cruz example earlier, right, that means you must support the president. So all of this is played in. You also noted all these significant events in history. Coming out of every crisis, the presidency emerges more powerful. World War II made the president more powerful. The Great Depression made the presidency more powerful. The Cold War made the president more powerful. 9/11 made the presidency more powerful. So every new power wielded by, you know, or a new power wielded by George W. Bush is now a power that Barack Obama and that Donald Trump, right, assumes that they have. And so these powers have, you know, like a brick wall, you know, just layered on top, one over the other. And there'll be yet another crisis of some sort, perhaps unforeseen in the future, that will, again, we'll look to the president to resolve it. And to resolve it, presidents will exercise a power they didn't have before, and that's yet another new authority that modern presidents will have, future presidents will have, that presidents may not have had in the past.
Yeah, there really is this sort of layering structure that happens. Anything that the president does and gets away with, the next president can do exactly the same thing.
Even if they may have complained about it, now that their president or their party's in power, you know, we're going to use it now, obviously. So,
and that's why you have to be careful what you do, because you're going to be out of power eventually.
Absolutely.
And they're going to have all the tools that you used. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I think it's a very sort of dangerous circumstance. There was a period of time after Watergate where people were actually freaking out. Arthur Schlesinger wrote The Imperial Presidency, and started talking about it. And of course, after Watergate, people were concerned with the overwhelming power of the presidency. And so they did have some reforms, but they were kind of toothless reforms. So we had the War Powers Resolution Act that was passed over a presidential veto. And
yeah, the Case Act.
Right.
Yeah, and some other things. Yeah. Yeah, as you said, it was somewhat fleeting, though. You know, it seems as if there is a historical linear trajectory that really can't be stopped to centralize more power. And, you know, part of it, as you said, you noted that foreign policy now is done quickly. Well, you know, just about everything has to be done quickly now. We live in this modern age. The only institution equipped to do that, Congress cannot act quickly or decisively. And in fact, you were talking about the Unitarian presidency. That's kind of the heart of their argument. It goes back to Hamilton, as you said, who argued you need a strong and decisive president to pull together this fragmented system and to get anything done. There's some merit to that. But on the other hand, it can't become distorted to the point at which the other supposedly co-equal branches, and particularly Congress, becomes second fiddle, becomes a sideshow of sorts. But that's pretty much what we have. Presidents now control the budget process, which should have been entirely controlled by Congress if you go back to the Constitution. Certainly the Senate should have a more powerful role in consulting the president with regards to foreign policy. In almost every area of policy where maybe the president wasn't given constitutional authority, Congress has acquiesced it to the president. And where the president does have constitutional authority, Congress has given the president a free hand.
I hadn't thought of what you said, or I think it was either you or Kupfer that said that maybe Biden, as a former member of Congress, will seek to empower Congress more. Now, he hasn't made any statements like that on the campaign trail, and he's going to have a lot of pressure to produce. I think that this is not a Machiavellian plot where people are sitting around in a room together and saying, we need to give all the power to the presidency. It's much more organic in the process. And I think one of the organic features of our current society is the way in which we idolize celebrity. And so, and Stephen, you talked about it, where the media is lazy. They don't want to learn Congress. And so it's easy to just simply go to ask the president what he thinks about it. And he might not even have authority, but once all of the media broadcast his voice, which of course is the bully pulpit, which is a major power of the presidency, and now Trump has turned that into the tweet. This is
Tweet pulpit.
Yeah, the Tweety pulpit. Sorry, I guess.
Yeah.
That is it's magnified it even more. And so that the president's words are a lot more powerful than they would be if the media wasn't doing that. I mean, I think in some ways about sports, basketball became more popular than baseball in some ways, because basketball has fewer players and more personalities, right? Whereas baseball's, just much bigger teams. And so it's hard for the media to sort of focus on the celebrities. And so it's not malevolent. It's not some conspiracy. It's kind of happening in a very organic fashion. I would be surprised if one person could really stop this snowball effect of increasing executive power.
Right. Yeah. Kind of going back, again, kind of in a tutorial sense, I guess, the alternatives to this Unitarian Hamiltonian model are, kind of varied, but Jefferson, I immediately thought of kind of the Jeffersonian model of the president. You noted he'd be appalled at the fact that presidents are now giving State of the Union addresses live, and primarily for political benefit. And there's the Jeffersonian model of the president, which is taken to its extreme. I know Jefferson didn't view the presidency this way, but taken to its extreme, would view the president as almost like a clerk. Congress passes the laws, Congress sets policy, the president follows through, just executes the will of Congress, in which case Congress would be in the driver's seat. And then you kind of have the Minnesotian model where they should be co-equal partners. But, you know, those three models, Jeffersonian, Madisonian, Hamiltonian, the Hamiltonian model is clearly won out. And
maybe if the other founders could rap, maybe then they would have been listened to. No, I'm joking.
Maybe so.
That's a terrible joke.
Good brevity.
But, yeah, it's Hamilton. We're living in Hamilton's world, I guess.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, we are. Yeah, we are. You're right. Yeah, yeah. His vision has really prevailed, and then some.
Yeah. So I'd like to see. I'm sorry, Charlie.
Go ahead.
I'd like to see some reforms. I mean, let's face it. I'm not going to pretend to be even-handed about this. If Biden is elected, I'd like to see him curtail the power of the presidency.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. You know, it's going to happen one of two ways. Either a president himself or herself is going to take the lead to restore some balance, or Congress is going to have to decide to do that. And again, all of the organic forces in play work against that now. In a weird sort of way, you know, yeah, I would be hopeful that Biden would do the same. But now that, you know, the Democrats may have control of all three branches, why mess up that opportunity? You know, so I think the organic factors associated with that are going to be, you might see an even more powerful president because Biden should be able to pretty much get whatever he wants through Congress, notwithstanding some divisions within the party. So we'll see how it plays out.
Right. So we hope that's not the case. But as we talk about the powers that the president has, are there any not to say powers, but the role of the vice president? Does he have any power under his belt in his role?
So that varies depending on the president. So the president can, if he doesn't like the vice president, he can send him off to funerals in foreign countries, and he can give them ridiculous jobs. Kennedy didn't really like LBJ, and he didn't trust him, so he would go ahead and he would send him to Vietnam all the time. And LBJ was very resentful. Hubert Humphrey under LBJ, you would think that after LBJ was treated poorly, then he would treat Hubert Humphrey poorly. And it was interesting because somebody asked LBJ, what about Hubert Humphrey, your vice president? You know, what does he think about it? And LBJ was crass, and he said, I have his manhood in my back pocket. He didn't say manhood. And so vice presidents can be treated like servants. And certainly Mike Pence kind of falls into this category. Mike Pence has zero power. There is an exception, and the exception was Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney, in the beginning of the George W. Bush president, was almost as powerful as the young president. But George W. Bush resented that and eventually cut him off at the knees. And so he was powerful up until the second term, and then George W. Bush completely cut him out of any decision-making. And the president can do that. He has all the power. The president can turn his custodian into the second most powerful person in the White House. They can do whatever they want. It's a very strange, and a lot of presidents have members of their cabinet that they just don't even bother to meet with.
Yeah, you know, first things first, Charlie, that's a good question. You know, sometimes we forget about the vice president, and, you know, for good reason. For one thing, the Constitution only mentions the vice presidency twice. And in one sense, making the vice president the presiding officer of the Senate. More about that in just a second. And the second being that the president is first in line for the presidency if something were to happen to the president. And no formal powers other than a tie-breaking vote in the Senate are given to the vice president. So constitutionally, vice presidents are relatively impotent. that's a strike against them to start. And then, Ted, as you said, vice presidents are only as powerful as the presidents that they serve under allow them to be. And some vice presidents have been more powerful than others. Dick Cheney, kind of one of the obscure parts of history is, Walter Mondale was one of the more powerful vice presidents, and in part because Jimmy Carter came to the White House from being the governor of Georgia, and his inside knowledge of the workings of D.C. Weren't perhaps as astute as a long time serving senator. And so, with Walter Mondale having served in the Senate for so long, he really leaned on Mondale a lot for understanding the nuances of Washington politics. Ted, when you were talking about LBJ, just to add to that, we all probably have a circle of friends, and in some cases, two of those friends do not get along. LBJ and Robert F. Kennedy did not get along. They hated each other. They were born with this gene that they could not tolerate one another. And of course, John Kennedy relied perhaps more on his brother than anybody else, but certainly was going to include his brother in the most important meetings. And in a sense, you could argue a lot of times LBJ was shut out because you didn't want those two people in the same room together. If RFK is going to show up for the meeting, LBJ can't. So that's kind of a humorous part of that. But the other kind of humorous story is, our very first vice president, John Adams, he went over to the Senate on the first day to perform his duties as presiding officer over that body. And the Senate set the stage very quickly. If you think about it, the Constitution does make the vice president the presiding officer of the Senate. Well, if I read that, I'd be like Adams. Okay, I'm going to go over there and I'm the leader of the Senate. I'm going to kind of direct their business. I'm going to have a say in what they do, and in fact, perhaps lead what they do. But the Senate, it's interesting. Here's your separation of powers. Here's how institutions protect their turf. Right off the bat, the Senate ignored him. The Senate let him know immediately, you have no authority here. If there's a tie vote, we get it. You can break it. But other than that, they literally ignored him. He would bring a newspaper and he would sit in the front of the Senate and he would read the newspaper, and they went about their business with little or no attention to him. And it set that standard. And it's why, eventually the Senate had to create a president pro tempore, one of their own members to preside over the Senate when the vice president's not there, because 99.9% of the time the vice president isn't there. There's no reason for him to be there, he or she, because the Senate, right, they don't want any part of the executive branch running their business. That's what would have been the case had they allowed him to be the kind of power, I guess, he thought he had. So this is a good lesson too. The Constitution can specify these things, but how they're practiced, how they're exercised goes a long way, and just how much power or how far that power extends.
Yeah, just to talk about a much more modern version of this belief that maybe the vice president has a lot of power over Congress. Dick Cheney, of course, called himself the leader of the Senate. And a lot of his advisors worked under John McCain. And there was a very interesting dialogue that took place between Sarah Palin and Biden. And apparently, some advisors of Cheney got a hold of Palin and told her she was going to be the head of the Senate. And so she got up during the vice presidential debate and said, I'm going to run the Senate. And I was like, wow, where did that come from?
Yeah.
And so,
yeah.
But it's an interesting thing that, and this is going back to what we said in the last class, which was the Constitution is 7,000 words. It's very vague. And so it's up to the interpretation of the people that are doing it. It's not clear as to what role each and every part of the government will play. And it's kind of, I don't want to say it's make it up as you go along, because there is precedent, but there's a lot of leeway.
and which, you know, is by design. You know, for a constitution to endure, it has to be flexible. And, you know, of all the, you know, sometimes we can, you know, complain or maybe discuss things that should be changed in the Constitution, but I think its brevity is part of, again, you used the phrase last time, Ted, we were talking, you know, it's part of its brilliance is that it's precise enough, you know, that we know what roles each person plays, but it's also vague enough to be flexible so that different ages can, you know, interpret and apply that document. You know, it's why we call it a living document. I know that bothers some people, but it shouldn't. It doesn't mean that we're changing the language. It just means we're applying the language in a more contemporary way to fit our needs, which is their design. That's how they intended. They knew the country would change and that they needed to craft a document that would be flexible enough to guide us, but to allow us necessary changes so that it never became outdated.
We mentioned the cabinet and the 15 departments. How are those cabinet members appointed for those students that don't quite know the process?
Well, they're appointed by the president, and in fact, they're appointed by the president, and they have to be confirmed by the Senate. So we're back again to this fact. You notice how whatever we talk about, Congress has these sufficient checks on the president, and they do wield this one. But one of the interesting things we've been noting, you know, if Biden becomes president, a lot of people are speculating, you know, what the first thing presidents have to do is set up their administration, decide who are going to be the people that the president will have to delegate authority to run that massive bureaucracy and to advise them. And I don't want to use, I want to give Ted time to talk about this too, but I will say this, it is largely a myth that the cabinet serves as an advisory body to the president. I guess that started with Andrew Jackson, I guess, the kitchen cabinet, but it's really the executive office of the president, the EOP, where the closest advisors, I think that's where the White House office is staffed. It's where the Congressional Budget Office exists. It's where the National Security Council and other very important agencies. But starting in the 1950s, after World War II, there was a massive reorganization of the executive branch, and that included the creation of this executive office of the president. And even in proximity, you know, I show my classes when I lecture on this a map of DC, and the executive office building is right next to the White House. It's literally within walking distance, though they use tunnels underground to go back and forth. But it's this huge building that looks like a haunted house. It's out of place in DC. Every other building in DC is that kind of Greco-Roman architecture. This looks like a big, giant, kind of purplish haunted house. It's actually quite beautiful. But it's where all those offices exist. And so when we talk about the president's administration, people will be wondering, well, who's he or she going to appoint Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense? And these aren't unimportant positions. But it's also important, you know, who are they going to appoint to their Council of Economic Advisors? You know, that those people in a lot of ways wield as much or more power than any of the secretaries that head up the executive departments. So it's called the EOP, the Executive Office of the President. And, you know, when I diagram the presidency for my classes, you have the president, the vice president, and then below that, I have the EOP. And below the EOP, you have your executive departments. Because the executive departments are really more of an implementation body, right? They implement them, you know, we had more time to talk about this too. They, you know, within those departments, they wield a lot of pseudo legislative and judicial authority as well. But in terms of an advisory role, that's fulfilled almost entirely by the offices in the executive office of the president, the EOP. So.
Right, and of course, part of that reform that took place after World War II was the National Security Council.
Exactly. Yep.
And the National Security Council, and specifically one position in particular is the National Security Advisor, does not necessarily need to be approved by the Senate. And it's a very powerful position, or it can be in some presidencies. And then the other position that is not approved, which I think is significant, is the chief of staff of the president. Now, some chiefs of staffs are more powerful than others. Meadows right now is a particularly weak chief of staff, and it's
figure.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't Trump want a powerful chief of staff? Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of people say, Trump is Trump's chief of staff because the chief of staff basically controls access to the president in many of the administrations. And so if you're setting the president's schedule, then you can exclude people from being able to meet the president and operate as sort of an armed guard at the door of the Oval Office. And some chief executives have been arguably more powerful than the president at times, or the perception was that they were more powerful because they started to just exclude people from reaching the president. So John Sununu, in particular, under the George H.W. Bush administration, saw himself almost as the most powerful person, in some ways more powerful than the president. So they had to fire him. And they actually brought in George W. Bush to fire his dad's chief executive because he made, quicker decisions than George H.W. Bush would kind of, think too much about this. And then there were other powerful chief executives. Donald Rumsfeld under Gerald Ford almost was more powerful than the president himself.
Go back to the Nixon administration, and some historians argue that Nixon's lack of touch with the American public over time waned considerably because his chief of staff was very selective in who was allowed access to Nixon, and some argue that led to some terrible decisions by the president, that the president wasn't getting full amount of information that maybe he needed. Ted, you were talking about the National Security Council. It's interesting. We go back again to the original Constitution that was designed. Ever since the National Security Council and the position of the National Security Advisor was created, on almost every administration, there's been some tension between the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor, and which one the president should lean on more. And Ted, I don't know if you agree with this or not. I think you probably will. The National Security Advisor always tends to be a bit more hawkish, and the State Department and the Secretary of State is usually the one saying, "Well, let's use diplomatic means to resolve these conflicts." And so, that creation of that office, that's a good point. Bringing that up has really changed the foreign policy establishment. In a lot of ways that people don't realize. It's minimized what was, I guess, considered, and could still be considered the most important cabinet department, who's going to be the Secretary of State. But, starting with Nixon again, we go back to Nixon, presidents have really kind of replaced the advice maybe they used to receive from the Secretary of State with the National Security Advisor.
Right. And of course, the most powerful National Security Advisor that we've ever had in our history was Henry Kissinger.
Yeah.
Who was both National Security Advisor and Secretary of State. Right. So he held both positions. And so
maybe that's the answer. I don't know. Yeah, but that didn't turn out real well, though.
So what ended up happening, and I love these sort of anecdotal stories, is sort of Nixon became paranoid at the end, and he went downstairs and he was drinking a little bit too much and bowling. There's a bowling alley in the White House. And people started to worry about his mental health. And the word went out from James Schlesinger, his Secretary of Defense, that if Nixon ordered a war, that you shouldn't follow that. So, it's a very interesting thing that the presidency, you would think that there would be checks and balances, and that it would be up to Congress to decide on war or peace. It says it right there in the Constitution.
Technically, they should. Yeah, yeah.
But that's not the
should.
case, right?
No,
It ultimately now rests with the president, and so we're really stuck in some ways. I mean, it's a little scary. It's the stuff of movies. It's, you know, where the president sort of loses his mind or becomes malevolent or, you know, goes off the deep end. What are you supposed to do? How do you check this person? And we don't have a lot of checks. We don't.
And we're back to that risk of concentrating too much power in the hands of the one or the few. There's a reason for why you want some dispersal of power and you know, a healthy system of checks and balances. And particularly in this age of, you know, if nothing else comes out of this age of very hard partisanship, I'm beginning to think people are finally going to learn, since they're so scared of the other side. Maybe they'll come to realize maybe it's not such a bad thing that there are some checks on what certain people can do once they get into office. So maybe that will be one small positive outcome from our otherwise deep, you know, kind of partisan hole we find ourselves in right now.
One can hope.
Yeah, yeah. I can remember, and you know, I want to be careful here. This isn't an anti-Trump thing at all, but Ted, you probably remember when Trump had won the election, we had a meeting with international students because there was concern at the time that nobody knew, right, what exactly Trump would do, and if you recall, you know, we noted at that meeting that, well, you know, here's where checks and balances kick in. Here's where separation of powers kick in. If you don't like who's been elected president, and the same could be true for those that don't like Biden, you know, here's where checks and balances, separation of powers, here's where this pays off, you know, assuming that it's followed. You keep going back to the Constitution because I think that's kind of important in this series. And when you look at Article 1, Section 8, which is where the Constitution, you know, delegates power to Congress, the words are very definitive, very clear. They begin with the words, Congress shall have the power to. And then there's this lengthy list of authority. But when you look at the presidency under Article 2, there's no definitive section that says, okay, here are the powers. There are actually two sections, and the language is very soft. Shall take care to the president, right? And there's not that same type of definitive language. So in some ways, the vagueness of Article 2 kind of has lent more flexible interpretations of what all the president can do. The language just isn't quite as definitive. And I think it's because the founders really weren't absolutely certain what all they would need the president to do and you know, how much power the executive branch would need to wield. And I think you find that in the way that Article 2 is written. As compared to Article 1, they all had legislative experience. All the founding fathers did. They knew very well what the legislative branch would do and what they wanted it to do. But I think there was a less certainty in the crafting of the executive branch.
Towering figures of the 19th century were like Daniel Webster and John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay. Those were actually members of Congress. Those were the people that were actually writing the legislation. But now, because of the campaign, the president presents what he's going to do. So it's not Congress that's writing the laws. It's actually the president gives over his agenda, which is the agenda of his party. And it's interesting when students are studying campaigns, they don't know any of this past history. They don't know that the president can't just go, okay, everybody, free college, Medicare for all, you know, and they hear the campaigning president and they're just like, well, what do I get? You know, what are you going to do for me? And really, you know, and this is where the two presidencies come. Yes, he's the dictator in terms of foreign policy, but in terms of domestic policy, he's got to get the approval of Congress. And it's interesting. And
Yeah,
going,
what's the old adage? You know, the president initiates, Congress deliberates. You know, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but you know, you're exactly right. That's the way it works now. The president sets the agenda. And yeah, but anyway, go ahead, Ted, I'm sorry.
but it's interesting because, okay, hypothetically, if Biden were to win both houses and the presidency, a lot of people would expect that that he gets his entire agenda passed. But looking at it historically, that hasn't been the case. Carter fell on his face when he got into power, and he was having real problems with Congress in spite of the fact that they were Democrats. Clinton had a terrible first year as president and was unable to pass any health care plan. So it took a while. Now, Biden does have an advantage. I guess the best precedent for a Biden presidency would be LBJ, because both of them were very powerful within the Senate. So he wouldn't be coming in naive. He knows the institution. And so we'll see what he's able to accomplish. It'll be interesting to see if he becomes the president. I mean, you know, the polls were wrong in the last election. They could be wrong again.
Yeah, I think just to follow up on what you said, I think people discount or disregard probably a bit too much the divisions that exist sometimes within parties. And in a weird kind of way, I think those divisions are amplified when your party has absolute power. Because now all of a sudden you can see that brass ring, and now all of a sudden, right, what the liberal Democrats want, you know, they see that opportunity, and that might come into conflict with what the moderate Democrats want. And, you know, in some ways, you know, and now they don't have to band together, you know, because it's a minority party or to stand up to Republican power. And so, like you said, it's going to be interesting to watch if the Democrats capture all three institutions, what that will do to the party, and how well they'll be able to govern, or whether they'll fracture as a result of this. And that'll largely determine about Biden's success. What can he get through Congress, even if his party controls it?
It goes back to the old joke. It's like, I'm not a part of an organized party. I'm
Right.
a Democrat. You know,
Right,
it's like the Democratic Party has always been this sort of schizophrenic beast, right?
Yeah.
You've got these moderate Democrats like Biden, and maybe, you know, I know people hate Hillary and thought she was some sort of radical communist, but she's a moderate, you know.
A moderate, right, exactly.
And then you have the sort of Bernie Sanders AOC part of the Democratic Party. And so these are very conflictual. And so we'll see whether they're able to sort of come to an agreement if Biden wins. And that's a big if.
All right. Well, I don't have anything else coming in the chat. I want to thank you two now, for sharing that wealth of information, and I would say clarity, and more of a go dig deep and really reread the Constitution and see how it was written. And like you all said, it's the interpretation, how you interpret it. It wasn't set in stone. It's set in stone, but reading in between the lines, really, at the end of the day, and how we came to be where we are today. So I thank you all once again for the executive branch. And tomorrow we have our last standing branch, which is quite interesting again, which goes back to the power. So I can't wait to hear more about the judicial branch tomorrow. So thank you again for chiming in, tuning in with this session today, and we will see you all tomorrow with the judicial branch. You all take care and have a good one.